Verna is a show cave in the municipality of Saint-Engrâce in the Pyrénées-Atlantiques department of France. It is also the terrible place where Marcel Loubens tragically perished. Marcel Louben was about 35 feet up when the clip holding him to the wire snapped. He slipped off the line, screamed, and fell more than 100 feet to the ground. When Marcel Louben's companions reached him, Louben was barely alive. The Verna cave is described as a semi-wild cave because of three criteria. There is no light system, which is problematic because of the huge size of the chamber. There is no personal light source, no matter how bright, that will be able to light this cave appropriately. There are still no trails, as the tours use the path constructed. The rest of the cave is undeveloped. Any of this happens with show caves, however. Three of the most important criteria, light, trails, as well as accessibility, are not sufficiently met here. And just like that, cave enthusiast Marcel Louben fell in love with caving at a young age. He was born on June 30th, 1923, and Marcel already wanted to meet the famous French cave explorer Norbert Casteret by the age of 13. This wish would come true in 1940, and he would eventually go on numerous expeditions alongside Norbert, who would become a mentor to Marcel. Marcel wanted to go deeper and further into the rocky heart of the earth than any man had ever been able to go before. In 1943, while on an expedition, Marcel was seriously injured by a falling boulder while assisting a fallen teammate. The incident gave him a fractured shoulder and several broken ribs, and it would take 13 hours to rescue him from the cave. Undeterred by this event, Marcel would go on to undertake increasingly grand and daring projects. In 1951, Marcel made his first expedition to Verna cave system to a section known as the Pierre Saint-Martin chasm. Discovered just a year prior, the chasm was thought to be an entry point to what was then thought to be the most profound cave system in the entire world. The expedition started in a nearby French village and then traveled up to the cave system's entrance at an altitude of 5,700 feet. That year, a winch system was devised and cemented to the opening of the chasm to speed up the descent down the 1,100-foot shaft. Marcel was actually the first person to use that system, and he clipped his harness to the winch hook and then backed himself over the ledge into the 1,100-foot abyss below. The men joining him in the cave for this expedition were volcanologist Haroun Tazif, physicist Jacques Labarrie, and Giuseppe, also known as Beppo, Occalini, who was also a physicist. The Saint-Martin Deep proved to be the entry point to what was thought back then as the deepest reached cave system in the world, a series of chambers leading down at last to an underground river, and it became the focus of extreme speleological activity. In 1952, to hurry up the movement of people up and down the shaft, an electric winch was cemented in place at the mouth of the chasm. Marcel Louben was probably one of the most committed explorers of Pierre Saint-Martin at that time, as he volunteered to make the first winch-powered descent of the shaft himself. He then clipped himself onto the wire and backed over the chasm's edge. Marcel and Haroun were lowered into the cave along with some equipment to set up their camp. They chose a decently sized 16-foot by 16-foot outcropping that was one of the only flat sections of the cave. The next day, they spent almost the entire day waiting for phone contact with the surface to coordinate the ascent and descent of a bunch of equipment they would need to explore the cave. With the arrival of the equipment, Jacques and Giuseppe were also lowered into the cave to join Marcel and Haroun. The day after that, the men worked hard from dusk till dawn, prospecting a massive wall in the oval room of the cave. Despite their efforts, they couldn't find any new shafts or passageways that might lead down to lower levels. They tried following the river, which was a little more than a stream at this point in the year, all the way to where it threaded its way through the boulders at the end of the oval room, but the stream squeezed down to a point, making it impossible to survey any further due to its size. In the evening, just before they had to head back to camp for that evening, they stumbled on a small entrance to a well. They dropped stones into the opening, and they heard a bounce, then a few seconds of silence. This signaled a potential promising depth to an unexplored passage. It had already been almost 3 days under a mountain, and they had little to show for it. The following morning, tired from the previous day's events, the men took their time leaving their warm sleeping bags and slipped into their damp clothing. They then returned to the room they had spent the day prior. 3 men carried over 100 pounds of fluorescein between them, and Haroun carried about 40 pounds of camera equipment. Their goal was to dump all of the fluoresceins in the stream that ran through the cave in hopes of determining where it reappeared on the surface. The fluorescein they were carrying is a deep red powder that turns into an emerald color when it's mixed with water. The group finally felt like they were making some headway, and they were tempted to follow the passageway to the end, but they were also tired, and it was getting late in the day, so they decided it would be best to leave the rest of the exploration to the following day. And unfortunately, it was supposed to be Marcel's last day in the cave. On the 5th day, the men climbed up to the small platform, where the winch cable was firmly anchored, and helped him into his waterproof suit and his pilot's helmet with integrated earphones to radio the surface. He clipped on his harness, checked the rest of his equipment, and then radioed up to the surface to let them know he was ready to ascend. The cable then started to pull, and Marcel was lifted slowly along the room wall with his equipment in tow toward the distant skylight 1,100 feet above him. The way that the cable was strung up and the way that the room was shaped meant that he didn't ascend perfectly vertically at first. He sort of went up on an angle. This meant that the men could climb slowly with him along the boulders at the start of the ascent. Shortly after that, the cable started to pull again, and Marcel resumed his ascent up the horizontal wall of the cave. On his other hand, he held a magnesium torch that he would light once he was a few meters off the ground so that Haroun could film his ascent up the chasm. Finally, Marcel left the ground, and his dark silhouette rose slowly up the shaft. The only thing visible now was the small lamp on his chest. One friend pointed his camera at Marcel, expecting any second to see the bright magnesium flare light up. Then, all of a sudden, Marcel let out a short cry. A second later, there was a horrible crash, and Marcel bounced along the boulders from which he had just risen. Marcel Louben was about 35 feet up when the clip that held him to the wire buckled. He cried out as Marcel slipped from the line, fell, and smashed into the boulder field at the base of the shaft, and then bounced for more than 100 feet from rock to rock. When Marcel Louben's companions reached him, Louben was hardly alive. Great efforts were made to rescue him, however. His injuries were so many and so severe, among them a broken spine and a fractured skull, that it proved impossible to move him. He died 36 hours after first falling. It would take another 90 feet of tumbling on the jagged boulders before he would finally come to a stop. The two friends ran to the still body of Marcel to find him lying flat on his stomach across a slope. They anxiously pointed their flashlights at his face and saw that it was now covered in blood. The following year, in 1953, a new expedition was led into La Vira Cave. This time, an entirely new winch was manufactured and installed at the mouth of the chasm. On the 8th of August, Marcel's childhood hero Norbert descended with an aluminum container. Marcel's body was placed into the container 2 days later and cremated 1,100 feet under the ground at La Vira Cave. At the bottom of the chasm, near the camp of the fateful expedition, burned into the rock, it says, "Here, Marcel Louben lived the last days of his courageous life." What are your thoughts on this? Let us know in the comment section down below. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, take a deep dive into the like and subscribe buttons. Let us know what you thought of it in the comments. See you again soon in another video, if you dare.